The 49th presidential election was held on November 4th, 1980. This election consisted of 9 parties and 1 independent. These parties were the Republican, Democratic, Libertarian, Citizens, Communist, American Independent, Socialist Workers, Right to Life, and Peace and Freedom parties. Former California Governor Ronald Reagan and his running mate, former Director of Central Intelligence George H.W. Bush, won the Republican primary election with 59.79% of the vote. President Jimmy Carter and his running mate, Vice President Walter Mondale, won the Democratic primary election with 51.1% of the vote. Carter's campaign was seen more as a negative campaign, as Reagan's campaign was seen to be more optimistic. Carter states that Reagan would end social programs created in the New Deal. Reagan stated that the United States military needed to be built up. Both Carter and Reagan were unpopular, but Carter was more unpopular due to how he handled his presidency. This election saw the modern alignment of today's politics. Most conservatives backed the Republican Party, while most progressives backed the Democratic Party. This was the beginning of a rift that would slowly rip America apart over the decades. Reagan stated that the American people needed to end their trust with the American government. He wanted to balance the budget and lower taxes. He famously said, quote, "A recession is when your neighbor loses a job, a depression is when you lose yours, and recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his." He also stated that he wanted to end price controls on oil. Reagan stated that he was a supporter of civil rights and that he wanted to elect the first female Supreme Court justice. Carter was seen to be unprepared for a second term, as he criticized Reagan's plans but did not promote his own plans. Carter said that Reagan was racist for supporting states' rights, but 2 days later Reagan made a speech about how he wanted to help invest into black communities. Reagan mistakenly stated that Carter began his campaign in the birthplace of the KKK, making it sound like he thought all of the southern states supported the KKK. Carter was unpopular due to his failure to handle the Iranian hostage crisis, inflation, high interest rates, and high unemployment. There were 2 presidential debates, with an average viewership of 80.6 million. That's a 34.5% increase from 1976. The polls had Jimmy Carter winning the election with 52.8% of the popular vote, and Reagan with 41.8%. In the end, Reagan pulled an upset victory. He won 50.75% of the popular vote and 90.89% of the electoral vote. That was the best electoral vote performance since 1972. The polls underestimated Reagan by 8.95%. That means the polls were 0.87% less accurate than in 1976. This election was polarizing due to both candidates calling each other racist while splitting the country between conservatives and progressives. The 50th presidential election was held on November 6, 1984. This election consisted of 9 parties and 1 independent. These parties were the Republican, Democratic, Libertarian, Citizens, Populist, New Alliance, Communist, Socialist Workers, and Workers' World parties. President Ronald Reagan and his running mate, Vice President George H.W. Bush, won the Republican primary election with 98.8% of the vote. Former Vice President Walter Mondale and his running mate, New York Representative Geraldine Ferraro, won the Democratic primary with 38.3% of the vote. Reagan got backlash for joking about bombing the Soviet Union. Mondale was criticized for being too hesitant on important issues. He wanted to stop the production of nuclear bombs and was a supporter of civil rights. Many women and Democrats did not like Mondale's choice for a running mate due to her having pro-life beliefs. She was also criticized for her husband being involved in multiple crimes. Reagan continued his optimism strategy, which made him popular. He was the oldest sitting president at the time. He was also being questioned about his age. When he was questioned in a debate, he responded by saying, quote, "I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I'm not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience." There were 3 presidential debates with an average viewership of 63.03 million. This is a 21.8% decline from 1980. There were no polls available for this election, but I assume Reagan was leading almost every poll due to his popularity. In the end, Reagan won re-election. He won 58.77% of the popular vote and 97.56% of the electoral vote. This was the best electoral vote performance since 1936. This election was still very polarizing due to both parties being very divisive with conservative and progressive ideas. The 51st presidential election was held on November 8, 1988. This election consisted of 4 political parties. These parties were the Republican, Democratic, Libertarian, and New Alliances Party. Vice President George H.W. Bush and his very intelligent running mate, Indiana Senator Dan Quayle, won the Republican primary election with 67.9% of the vote. Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis and his running mate, Texas Senator Lloyd Bentsen, won the Democratic primary election with 42.4% of the vote. Bush thought that Dukakis was too liberal. Dukakis responded that he was proud to be liberal. As Bush was riding with Reagan's popularity, he stated that he would be a more gentle version of Reagan in an attempt to win over more moderates. Bush said that Dukakis' education at Harvard made him a liberal elitist. Bush ran ads criticizing Dukakis for being weak on pollution and called him a radical. He was also criticized for being soft on crime. Dukakis staged a photo op in a tank to make him look pro-military, but he soon got backlash after he was exposed for opposing military spending in the past. Dan Quayle, Bush's running mate, was seen to be very incompetent by the public. There were 3 presidential debates that got an average viewership of 59.8 million. That's a 5.2% decline from 1984. The polls showed that Dukakis was going to win with 47.2% of the popular vote and Bush with 40.6%. But in the end, Bush pulled off an upset victory. He won 53.37% of the popular vote and 79.18% of the electoral vote. The polls underestimated Bush by 12.77%. It means the polls were 3.82% more inaccurate than in 1980. This election was more polarizing than the last, with Bush attacking Dukakis for being a radical liberal. The 52nd presidential election was held on November 3, 1992. This election consisted of 6 parties. These parties were the Democratic, Republican, Libertarian, Populist, New Alliance, and U.S. Taxpayers parties. Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton and his running mate, Tennessee Senator Al Gore, won the Democratic primary election with 52% of the vote. President George H.W. Bush and his running mate, Vice President Dan Quayle, won the Republican primary election with 72.8% of the vote. Bush criticized Clinton for being a draft dodger. Bush ran his campaign on the success of winning the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Republicans campaigned on Clinton being too progressive. There were 4 presidential debates with an average viewership of 62.6 million. That's a 4.7% increase from 1988. There are no available polls from this election. In the end, Clinton was able to win the election. He won 43.01% of the popular vote and 68.77% of the electoral vote. This election was polarizing due to Republicans criticizing Democrats for being too radical. The 53rd presidential election was held on November 5, 1996. This election consisted of 7 political parties. These parties were the Democratic, Republican, Reform, Green, Libertarian, Taxpayers, and Natural Law parties. President Bill Clinton and his running mate, Vice President Al Gore, won the Democratic primary election with 89% of the vote. Kansas Senator Bob Dole and his running mate, U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Jack Kemp, won the Republican primary election with 58.8% of the vote. Clinton criticized Dole for being an old conservative. Dole responded by saying that his generation won World War II, and Clinton's generation were a bunch of spoiled baby boomers. This helped Dole appeal to older voters while driving away younger voters. Dole stated that he wanted to cut taxes. Clinton stated that Dole would cut social programs. He also stated that Dole's tax cuts would worsen the deficit. There were 3 presidential debates that averaged 36.4 million views. That's a 41.9% decrease from 1994. Clinton ended up winning the re-election. He won 49.24% of the popular vote and 70.45% of the electoral vote. This election was polarizing as it continued the campaign strategies of calling one side radical conservatives while the other side radical progressives. The 54th presidential election was held on November 7, 2000. This election consisted of 7 parties. The parties were the Republican, Democratic, Green, Reform, Libertarian, Constitution, and Natural Law parties. Texas Governor George W. Bush and his running mate, former U.S. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, won the Republican primary election with 62% of the vote. Vice President Al Gore and his running mate, Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman, won the Democratic primary with 75.8% of the vote. Bush ironically stated that the United States should not be militarily involved in other nations' conflicts. Bush stated that politics had gotten too partisan and that he would try to end polarization in politics. Gore stated that Bush was not fit to be president. After Clinton's sex scandal, Bush promised to bring dignity back to the White House. There were 4 presidential debates that averaged 37.6 million views. That was a 3.2% increase from 1996. In the end, Bush was able to win in this tight election. Gore actually ended up winning the popular vote with 48.38%, while Bush won 50.37% of the electoral vote. This election was less polarizing than the last, but America was still very divided. The 55th presidential election was held on November 2, 2004. This election consisted of 8 parties and 2 independents. These parties were the Republican, Democratic, Libertarian, Constitution, Green, Peace, and Freedom, Socialist Workers, and Christian Freedom parties. President George W. Bush and his running mate, Vice President Dick Cheney, won the Republican primary election with 98.1% of the vote. Massachusetts Senator John Kerry and his running mate, North Carolina Senator John Edwards, won the Democratic primary with 61% of the vote. Bush presented himself as a leader while calling Kerry a flip-flopper. He did this to make himself look tougher on terrorism. Kerry tried to stick with mostly domestic issues. As President Bush cut taxes and stated that they would help the economy grow, Kerry stated that Bush failed to make jobs as president, and that Kerry wanted to reduce the deficit. Bush stated that Kerry would increase taxes. Bush stated that the involvement in the Middle East was successful in taking down terrorists. Kerry criticized Bush for lying about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which was the reason for starting the war. Bush helped provide health care programs while promoting private health care at the same time. Kerry wanted to create tax subsidies for businesses that provided health care. Kerry also criticized Bush for banning stem cell research on babies. Bush wanted to ban same-sex marriages, while Kerry thought it should be a state issue. There were 4 presidential debates that averaged 51 million views. That's a 35.5% increase from 2000. 4 days before the election, Osama bin Laden released a video taunting Bush about 9/11. As this seems to have been created to demoralize Americans about Bush's successes, it actually riled up Americans and reminded them of 9/11, making Bush even more popular. In the end, Bush won re-election. He won 50.73% of the popular vote and 53.16% of the electoral vote. This election was polarizing due to half of Americans wanting to be involved in the Middle East while the other half opposing. The 56th presidential election was held on November 4th, 2008. This election consisted of 6 parties and 1 independent. These parties were the Democratic, Republican, Libertarian, Constitution, Green, and America's Independent parties. Illinois Senator Barack Obama and his running mate, Delaware Senator Joe Biden, won the Democratic primary with 48.1% of the vote. Arizona Senator John McCain and his running mate, Alaska Governor Sarah Palin, won the Republican primary with 46.7% of the vote. McCain approved of the war in Iraq while Obama opposed it. Obama ran on the reality that this war did not need to start in the first place, as the means for invasion were based on a lie. Due to both the Iraq War and the Great Recession, Bush became very unpopular just 4 years after having the highest approval rating for any president in American history. McCain's age became an issue as he was in his 70s and couldn't raise his arms above his head due to an accident during the Vietnam War. McCain ended up dying in 2018. That would have been just 2 years after his hypothetical second term. Obama was seen as the much younger candidate. This was due to him being part of Generation X and the fact that he used the internet as part of his political campaign. Obama also wanted to create bigger government healthcare programs. There were 4 presidential debates that averaged 60.5 million viewers. That's an 18.7 increase from 2004. In the end, Obama won the election. He won 52.93% of the popular vote and 67.84% of the electoral vote. This was the best electoral college performance since 1996. This election was polarizing due to the war in Iraq and how the response to the Great Recession should be. The 57th presidential election was held on November 6, 2012. This election consisted of 8 parties. These parties were the Democratic, Republican, Libertarian, Green Constitution, Peace and Freedom, Justice, and American parties. President Barack Obama and his running mate, Vice President Joe Biden, won the Democratic primary election with 90.1% of the vote. Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney and his running mate, Wisconsin Representative Paul Ryan, won the Republican primary election with 52.1% of the vote. This election was mostly about Obamacare and the slow recovery from the Great Recession. Obama obviously supported Obamacare due to it being his policy, but Romney thought it was an attack on private healthcare and was too expensive for the federal government to manage. Romney criticized the slow economic recovery being due to too much federal spending, creating too much inflation, which in turn weakened the economy. There were 4 presidential debates that averaged 60.85 million viewers. That's a 0.6% increase from 2008. Obama ended up winning the election. He won 51.06% of the popular vote and 61.71% of the electoral vote. This election was a bit polarizing due to race politics becoming into play. The 58th presidential election was held on November 8th, 2016. This election consisted of 6 parties and 6 independents. These parties were the Republican, Democratic, Libertarian, Green, Constitution, and Socialism, and Libertarian parties. Chairman of the Trump Organization, Donald Trump, and his running mate, Indiana Governor Mike Pence, somehow won the Republican primary election with 44.9% of the vote. Former U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and her running mate, Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, won the Democratic primary election with 55.2% of the vote. Clinton focused on raising middle-class incomes, expanding women's rights, instituting campaign finance reform, and improving the Affordable Care Act. She also wanted to raise taxes on companies that move out of the United States. She supported equal pay between men and women, same-sex marriage, and making immigration easier. Trump wanted to lower how much the United States is involved in foreign conflicts. He opposed cutting social programs like Medicare and Social Security. He ran as an outsider who believed traditional politicians could get nothing of value done. This appealed to many voters who believe that not much has changed from when Obama first took office. Both candidates were extremely unpopular. Clinton was investigated by the FBI after it was found that she was sharing classified information within a private, unsecured email account. She also made a very distasteful, extremely polarizing statement, quote, just to be grossly generalistic, you could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. They're racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. This form of disgusting politics would be what consumed the 2016, 2020, and 2024 elections. Afterwards, she continued to call Trump racist and far-right. During a 9/11 memorial, Clinton left early due to feeling ill, and video footage showed her stumbling into a van, almost half-consciously. This made people feel unconfident about Clinton's health. On the other hand, audio surfaced of Trump talking about women, stating he could, quote, "I can't believe I wrote this, grab them by the Hillary Clinton." That is quite the quote. Trump apologized, but many believed it was the end of his campaign. Many Republicans called for him to drop out of the race. He also stated that he wanted to ban Muslims from entering the country because of the war on terror. He also stated that the government should spy on mosques. I'm just honestly glad Trump doesn't act like this anymore. 11 days before the election, the FBI reopened their investigation into Clinton's emails. There were 4 debates that averaged 64.8 million viewers. That's a 6.5% increase from 2020. That's a 6.5% increase from 2012. The polls showed that Hillary Clinton would beat Trump by just 2%. In the end, somehow in the crazy world that we live in, Trump was able to pull off an upset victory. Clinton, though, was able to win the popular vote with 48.18% of the vote. Trump won 56.51% of the electoral vote. This was the most polarizing election so far. This was due to both candidates being distasteful and Clinton labeling Trump as far-right in every ist and ism in the book. The 59th presidential election was held on November 3rd, 2020. This election consisted of 4 parties. These parties were the Democratic, Republican, Libertarian, and Green parties. Former Vice President Joe Biden and his running mate California Senator Kamala Harris won the Democratic primary election with 51.7% of the vote. President Donald Trump and his running mate Vice President Mike Pence won the Republican primary election with 93.99% of the vote. The COVID-19 pandemic was the main problem of this campaign. Even though temporarily closing the borders and the creation of the vaccine was liked, Trump shutting down the country was extremely hated. This is something that I very much remember. Nobody liked quarantine except for the weird antisocial people. People were forced out of their jobs, and a refusal to go to work, rather working from home or remotely, became widespread. Stimulus checks were also created instead of reopening the economy to help pump more money into the economy. The only thing these checks did was create inflation down the road. Most people believe that Trump waited too long to end the shutdowns. Although Trump's pre-COVID economy was outperforming Obama's and peace in the Middle East was looking like it was becoming a reality, nothing could trump COVID. Biden ended up running a similar campaign as Hillary Clinton in 2016, except this time he was a bit more reserved. Even though he was very old, people saw Biden as the average politician who could return America to normalcy. But when Biden's son's laptop contents were leaked, many people began to think of Biden as the average corrupt politician that got Trump elected in the first place. The contents include material that could link Biden to Chinese oil companies and his son to Ukrainian oil companies. Both candidates ended up being very unlikable. There were 3 presidential debates that averaged 64.7 million viewers. That was a 0.2% decline from 2016. In the end, Joe Biden was able to win the election. He won 51.31% of the popular vote and 56.88% of the electoral vote. This election was extremely polarizing due to both sides calling each other extremists and even bashing the other side's supporters. The 60th presidential election will be held on November 5th, 2024. So far there are 11 parties and 1 independent in this election. These parties are the Democratic, Republican, Libertarian, Green, American Solidarity, Approval Voting, Constitution, Independent American, Prohibition, which I didn't even know was still an issue, Socialism and Libertarian, Socialist Equality, Socialist Workers, and Socialist Parties. President Joe Biden and his running mate, Vice President Kamala Harris, won the Democratic primary election with 87.1% of the vote. Due to his unpopularity, the Democratic Party pushed him to pull out of the race. After he did pull out, the Democratic Party chose Vice President Kamala Harris as their presidential nominee and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as their vice presidential nominee. Also, due to Biden's unpopularity, someone special thought they could have a chance at winning re-election. Former President Donald Trump and his running mate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, won the Republican primary with 76.4% of the vote. So far, this election has been about three things. First is about abortion. After Roe v. Wade was decided by the Supreme Court, states were given the issue of abortion. With this, Harris wants to reverse this decision by making abortions illegal nationwide, while Trump has suggested that he wants only late-term abortions to be banned. And because this world loves to surprise me, Trump somehow has the more moderate stance on the more controversial issue. Foreign policy is another issue. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was seen as the biggest embarrassment since Vietnam, and was the very first thing that caused Biden to become unpopular. The war in Ukraine was seen as a weakness by Biden, as he told Putin that a small incursion into Ukraine was fine. This was seen by many people as Biden inviting Putin to invade Ukraine. The war in the Middle East is also seen as a failure due to it starting off as an anti-terrorist campaign in Gaza, and now as a regional conflict within the Middle East involving multiple countries that were not originally involved. This is seen as most people as Biden and Harris not being able to prevent war from spreading. The last is the economy. Inflation is the biggest issue. Even though I believe the inflation was created due to Trump's stimulus checks, Biden and Harris made it even worse by spending large amounts of money and ballooning the debt by printing money. As Trump is still not liked by many, he was able to tame himself and move closer to the center, making him significantly more likable today than he was in 2016. This shift in his personality has helped him save his personal image, and even though Harris is trying to distance herself from Biden, most people can't separate her from Biden due to most people believing that she has had a bigger role than Joe Biden in making most final decisions. This is due to how bad Biden's mental state has gotten as he has aged. The day I'm writing this, there have been 2 presidential debates with an average of 59.05 million views. That's an 8.8% decrease from 2020. And as both candidates keep calling each other radicals and threats to democracy, the political landscape has not just become the most polarizing since the Civil War, but the hottest as well. This is due to there being 2 assassination attempts against Trump and 1 drive-by shooting at one of Harris's campaign offices. So what can we learn from this era? We can learn that every year the election has been becoming more and more polarizing due to each side calling each other radicals and threats to democracy. So the 2 questions are, how have we become so polarized, and how can we depolarize ourselves? When America was founded, we were created on unity of defeating the British Army. After Washington was gone, America began to see the seam of America slowly rip apart. Politicians began to argue about federalism and anti-federalism. Well, these discussions were very civil and respectful. But not too long after, politicians slowly began to ditch the idea of running on policy, but running on the charisma of one's character. This made it to where it made chances higher for someone incompetent to make their way into government. It also made it to where the only thing the opposition can criticize is the personality of said politician. Due to this new strategy for winning the White House, incompetent people did find their way into the White House. With a continuous line of incompetent presidents, the United States started to rapidly tear itself in half over the topic of slavery. As America was becoming the 2-party system Washington warned not to become, politics started to become nasty. Both parties would say anything if it meant they would get the majority of the votes. The Democratic Party threatened that if a Republican won the election, then they would leave the United States. After Lincoln won, the Southern Democratic states left the Union. After the Civil War, the United States was once again united under the Union's victory, but the unity wasn't as strong as under Washington due to the South still feeling bitter about losing the war. After the Civil War, politicians began trying to find ways to bring money into politics, making politicians corrupt and more desperate to become president. This led to politicians ditching policy and mostly attacking their opponents personally and personal background. As the Civil War was over, the economy boomed. This was able to happen due to Republicans investing in industry and minority populations. As war ravaged Europe, lying became the new form of campaigning. Woodrow Wilson promised to keep America isolated from World War I, but then after becoming elected, he declared war on Germany and entered the war. This caused Americans to distrust the government even more. After the war, Wilson was kicked out. Afterwards, the economy started booming again. That was until the Great Depression hit. During the Great Depression, people began to become very polarized on what economic system actually works. Some thought that communism would replace capitalism, and most believed that this was a capitalist hiccup. Then America got involved in World War II after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. After the war, the economy boomed and people began to have trust with the government again. But that slowly started to fade as the Cold War began. As Kennedy was assassinated, the CIA refused to release any important documents on the event, making the government look very suspicious and distrustful. Johnson got America involved in the Vietnam War without any approval, and then implemented the draft. Nixon was caught spying on his opponents and was forced to resign. The government was arresting anyone they thought was communist, and the first outsider in a long time broke the economy. People were quickly losing trust in their government. At the same time, television and radio were now being used by politicians during elections, so more money and glamour was needed in campaigns. For a short 8 years under Reagan, the economy is brought back onto its feet, and people began to trust the government a little bit more due to Reagan seeming to be an honest politician. But once Reagan left, Bush came in and started the most polarizing campaign strategies of American history. He ran on calling his political opponents too liberal. He said this without really saying why. Afterward, campaigns went from a charisma battle to calling one person too progressive while the other person too conservative. Today, politicians have adapted this strategy to make it even worse. Politicians almost never campaign on policy. They mostly try to use charisma while saying their opponent is a Nazi and a threat to democracy who needs to be eliminated, while the other says that their opponent is a communist and a threat to democracy who wants to end America. There's really only one good solution to this issue, and it's that politicians need their campaign to be 100% about policy. And we can see that that's possible by comparing the 2024 presidential debates with the vice presidential debate. In the presidential debate, both candidates were trying to call each other crazy people while barely being able to say what they were running for. In the vice presidential debate, both candidates were a lot more respectful and talked about their policy. It did seem like Walz wanted to make the debate polarizing by calling Trump a threat to democracy, but Vance was very good with keeping the debate calm and respectful. If we want a less polarized America, we should vote for people like Vance. I'm not saying you should vote just for Republicans, but I'm saying we should vote for people who can get along with others and have civil discussions. We should elect someone who has a respectful attitude towards politics, and not someone who calls their opponent the enemy of the republic. I want to thank you for watching this episode. If you think I got something wrong, let me know in the comments. If you want me to look into a specific topic, also let me know in the comments. Subscribe if you enjoy this kind of long-form content. Subscribe to my Clips channel if you prefer to watch shorter segmented forms of this podcast. And finally, subscribe to my Shorts channel if you only want to hear my most informative quotes. Links to all my channels are in the description. Links to all my sources are also in the description. The next podcast will be about the book The Psychology of Totalitarianism by Matthias Desmet, so stay tuned for that. Anyways, I'll see you next time.